The Rest is Politics is powered by our friends at Fuse Energy.
And Fuse have lined up another giveaway, open to anyone who switches their electricity supplier to Fuse.
All you got to do is go to getfuse.com/politics and use the referral code politics when you sign up.
And this time we're putting some merch bundles together for them. I'm thinking hoodies, sweatshirts, hats. If you came to see us on tour, you might have seen some of it already.
But aside from the prizes, well worth considering switching to Fuse. Their tariffs are cheaper than any of the big six competitors, so you'll still be saving money even though the price cap has gone up.
And the great thing is, Fuse are a green electricity supplier. They generate power from their own solar and wind farms, and they invest 100% of profits into building more renewables, which means they're planning for a clean energy future.
It will take you just 3 minutes to download the app and sign up. Fuse will also handle everything with your old supplier, so you won't have to lift a finger.
So download the Fuse app now and use referral code POLITICS after signing up. Visit getfuse.com/politics for the terms and conditions and to learn more.
Welcome to The Rest is Politics with me, Alastair Campbell.
And with me, Rory Stewart.
So Rory, I think we should talk a bit about Ukraine. We should talk about these appointments by President-elect Trump, some of which are truly mind-boggling. And then I think we should have a bit of a deep dive into Britain for a while.
Good.
Here we are, Rory, 1,000th day of the Ukraine war. Not a bad time to take stock, but also we had this big shift in terms of the missiles that the Americans will allow the Ukrainians to use.
That's right. So Joe Biden has now approved the use of ATACMS, which allow the firing of missiles much deeper into territory, and particularly into Russian territory. And this will then unlock other missile systems, including the UK Storm Shadow system, which was being delayed by the White House. The context of this is that the Russians have been making pretty steady advances over the last few weeks and months, on average about 100 meters a day. We can talk a little bit about why they haven't broken more dramatically through the front line. But basically, the war is not going well for Ukraine. Russia's making advances. Russia has many more people than Ukraine. Ukraine's struggling to recruit. And a lot of the central systems that Russia uses to attack Ukraine are based quite deep into Russian territory and can't be accessed by most of Ukraine's weapon systems. But what was your first thought, before we get on to what's happening on the front line, your thought about what this means, Biden announcing something that suddenly that he's been delaying on for almost 2 years?
Well, my first thought was, given that he just had the meeting with Donald Trump in the White House, where, to be fair to Joe Biden, he did the constitutional thing, he was proper, he was polite, he did all the things that Trump didn't do when he lost. It's hard to imagine that they didn't discuss Ukraine. They had an hour together. It's hard to imagine that didn't come up. So my first thought was, well, this is Joe Biden, but he's not going to be there in January. Is Trump involved in this in any way? Is Trump even aware? And then Trump, I don't think, has said that much, but Donald Trump Jr. has put out something basically saying, why are they doing this without even giving my father the chance to go and make peace and save lives?
Let me push that for a moment, because I think the Republicans, last thing I want to do is end up becoming too much of an advocate for Trump, but I guess
This is unlikely.
I guess if Trump had done this, in the last dying 6 weeks of his presidency, made a massive defense foreign policy decision, which he knew the person who was coming in as president was going to reverse, probably there would be enormous media outrage, because it's a pretty good argument to say Biden is more than a lame duck at the moment. And we know that Trump's policy is absolutely opposed to continuing to provide more lethal support for Ukraine, and Biden's just done it. So presumably Donald Trump Jr.'s got a point here, which is this is a pretty peculiar thing to do. You'd be pretty annoyed. Let's say you were an incoming Labour government and the Tories, because there isn't a transition, it's less likely, but suddenly did something in the very last few days that completely poisoned one of your central policy planks. You'd be pretty angry, wouldn't you?
Yeah, I think you would. That being said, what you said earlier about the state of play in the war itself could underline why an American president feels this is the right time to do this.
The more mysterious is the question why the hell he didn't do it before, because the normal criticism from him is that, as usual, Biden is too little, too late. The
Mm.
pattern for almost 1,000 days is a request for a big weapons system,
Yeah.
the
Delay.
US saying, no, we can't possibly provide it, and then eventually they provide it, by which
Yeah,
time
and
the need for it
meanwhile,
has gone.
the bit that you missed in there, and the Russians meanwhile saying that if you do, that's going to provoke, I think their phrase yesterday was an appropriate and tangible response. They've got various formulations to make people think that one day Putin's going to fire off the nukes. I think the other thing it does bring home, so there's Keir Starmer at the moment at the G20 with, lots of other world leaders around the place. It does, as you say, bring into sharp focus a big decision for Britain as well about the Storm Shadow missiles. And my sense is that Starmer is pretty hard over on this.
So this unlocks Storm Shadow from the UK. It unlocks German missile systems. It creates the whole possibility of a new stage in the war, which would be allowing the Ukrainians to suddenly strike all these different Russian ballistic cruise missile drone systems, which are located in Russian territory. Till now, they've only really been able to strike them with drones. And the problem with drones is the drones are not going fast enough and they can't carry enough of a munitions load. So they're not inflicting the damage on the Russian supplies that these things can do. So in the dream scenario for Ukraine, this is now the possibility not just of weapon systems, but a full joined up, coordinated response to this Russian aggression. But if Trump, as seems likely, pulls back, is the UK going to step up? And there are a lot of people in Europe who hope the UK will step up, because a lot of Keir Starmer's statements to European leaders have been pretty bold on Ukraine. And I think if you were Poland or the Baltic states, you might see the UK as an absolutely critical ally, putting a bit of lead in the German pencil and pushing forward. Problem, doesn't come cheap. And the UK Treasury presumably would get the heebie-jeebies about the idea of Britain getting involved in a massive ramp-up of defence spending if the US remove $50 billion.
It also plays into this extraordinary kind of geostrategic conundrum that Trump's re-election has posed. So I was on the tube this morning and the guy next to me was reading the Daily Telegraph, and the story down at the bottom, it said that it was a Labour minister, Jonathan Reynolds, essentially saying we've got to be very careful not to disrupt the already disrupted trade with the European Union, which the Daily Telegraph interpreted as the government being ready to appease Europe following the election of Donald Trump, trying to frame this as a kind of either or. And I think we said last week, the statecraft challenge for Labour right now is to resist the blunt choice and try actually to restore our role as a kind of something of a bridge. But I think if Keir Starmer's out on his own, because Trump does go down a path that he might. Trump, by the way, has been a bit less hard over, say, than his nominee for Defence Secretary, this guy, Pete Hesketh, who is a real kind of, I don't even know how to put it. I mean, he talks about, he's very, very critical of European defence. He's not a supporter of further support for Ukraine. Now, of all the many underqualified nominees, he's right up there, so he may not survive.
Let me put you on the spot again. So let's say Trump does decide that he's going to stop support. So there isn't another $50 billion forthcoming from the US. In order to fill that gap, there's a big, big problem for UK and Europe. It's not just a financial problem. So it's not just finding 50 billion. It's actually massively ramping up production capacities, starting new plants to manufacture missiles that we're not currently manufacturing.
This could become part of the growth plan.
Could become part of the growth plan, but it would involve a huge amount of money, because the US can afford to get away with only 50 billion because they've got quite large production capacities, and all they've got to do is guarantee to buy 1 year's production.
Yeah.
If Europe tried to do it, they'd have to spend much, much more, because they'd have to open new factories and guarantee years of purchases or provide state guarantees. So let's say, for the sake of argument, Europe needed to find twice that amount of money with the UK. Is your sense of British politics, German politics, French politics, Polish politics, that they would be up for doing this if the US suddenly stopped writing checks? Is the appetite there to spend 100 billion euros doing this?
Well, I don't know what the numbers would be. I would argue Poland, yes. Britain, probably. France, very tricky. But Macron, definitely. French politics, tricky. And I would argue Germany, is going to depend on the election.
And just to understand that, so some of these far-right groups in Europe are basically don't like this Ukraine war. So
Well,
politicians in
they're
France and
basically
Germany,
pro-Putin.
yeah. So politicians in France, Germany, Austria, and elsewhere are having to decide what to do with maybe 20% of the population that really does not want to spend any more money on
Yeah.
Ukraine.
Yeah.
And is that sort of growing so much that centrist politicians are inclined to say, well, that's a fight I don't want to have, so actually we're not going to up spending on this stuff?
Listen, I think let's just take Germany. Germany's really interesting at the moment. So, in fact, one of the big things in relation to Ukraine this week was Chancellor Scholz phoning Putin.
Yeah.
First time they've spoken for 2 years.
Yeah.
Zelensky very unhappy about it.
Yeah.
Talked about it opening a Pandora's box. This is kind of a weak signal, etc.
And an odd timing because he called him after Trump's election.
Very odd timing, also because he's now in this political crisis at home.
He's a sort of Biden, isn't he?
Yeah, is he doing it for electoral reasons? So he got quite a lot of criticism.
So just to remind listeners, he's a Biden in the sense that his polling rating is terrible. There's likely to be an election in January. He's likely to lose that election.
Well, there is going to be an election early in the new year. If you look at the polls, he is probably going to lose it. I think the SPD's only chance of turning things around, and even then very difficult, is actually to put the very popular defence minister, Boris Pistorius, in charge. Scholz is not going to do that. The party probably wouldn't wear it. So Merz is going to be Chancellor.
The leader of the centre-right.
Leader of the CDU.
Yeah.
So I think you probably will end up with some kind of grand coalition, which is probably more likely to commit to more long-term support, because they'll then manage to keep out, as it were, the fringes.
But back to the phone call. So Scholz, in the slightly lame duck position, who may well not be in office in a few weeks' time, calls Putin shortly after Trump's election. Zelensky's angry. Donald Tusk, the Prime Minister of Poland, also angry and took to Twitter, saying, look, he called and then Russia mounted some of its biggest assaults ever. This proves that calling Putin doesn't do any good. What happened in that phone call? What was Scholz trying to achieve?
Well, I think to indicate that, I mean, the briefing that came out from the Germans was pretty firm. They have to stop this war. It was sort of putting it onto them. But of course, what the Russians did essentially was project it as they're all ready to negotiate. They're all looking for a deal, but we're going full on.
And I guess if you've been advising Scholz, one of the first things you'd point out is, regardless of the content of the call, Russia is going to spin it as weakness, negotiation.
I think the Germans then sort of tried to say that Scholz had been planning this for weeks. He'd been talking to other world leaders, and it was done almost like he was speaking for them. But that didn't really hold water. I mean, interesting how the other governments didn't really row in behind that. So I think it was a bit of a freelance operation. And of course, the reason he's ended up being attacked for it at home is because people are saying, look, this is a bit desperate. You're in political trouble. Therefore, you're trying to signal that you're the great peacemaking chancellor. So I'm not sure that it achieved his purpose. Imagine being Zelensky right now. He's having to do what other world leaders are doing in terms of sort of, we welcome President Trump and we had a very constructive discussion and blah, 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 blah. But he probably is there, sitting there thinking, what does Trump mean when he says he's going to sort it out in 24 hours? Obviously, he's not going to sort it out in 24 hours. It is a sort of Trumpian figure of speech. Do you have any confidence that Trump could lead the way to a deal that doesn't involve, one, Ukraine having to cede a considerable amount of territory, and two, the rest of Europe becoming more alarmed about the extent of Putin's power?
No, frankly, because there are two problems. One is that even if he had the outlines for deal, and we don't really know what this deal is, he doesn't really have the team to do the detailed work to deliver it. I mean, one of the tricks of making these kind of deals, as you lived through with the Good Friday Agreement, is that it's not just about the boss having an idea that they want a deal. It's an enormous amount of very, very detailed work on the ground, which he doesn't seem to have. But the second problem is that there's no incentive for Russia at all. Russia is currently advancing. Now, they've got a bit of a problem, and I don't want to sound like I'm a kind of enormous expert on Ukraine. For that, again, I encourage people to read Jack Watling's work with Russi. But what seems to be happening is they're punching through, and then they're having difficulty reinforcing in order to exploit their breakthroughs. But there's no doubt they're making steady progress. If a negotiation started and I were Putin, I would simply say, keep delaying and keep making advances while the negotiation continues.
Yeah.
Ultimately, why would Russia stop?
Yeah.
What's the deterrent? if they sense that Trump doesn't want this war, doesn't want to fund Ukraine, doesn't want to provide missiles, wants to stop you just pushing. And you could keep saying in international forum, we're having an interesting conversation with Donald Trump, there's some details still to be worked out. You just keep pushing forward.
Keep going. I think that is the fundamental weakness of the position that Trump set out. If you're Putin, you're sitting there, okay, Trump wants to enter this war. We know how he operates. We know what he likes. He likes the big dramatic move. I'll say a few words that look like we're heading in that direction, and I just keep going. And that is a big problem for Europe then.
And then there's the other issue, which is that some people in the Republican Party think that the answer is to put in a pro-Putin puppet in Kiev, and then Putin will stop. But it's not an America's gift. I mean, Ukraine is an independent country, and you can't just announce to the Ukrainian parliament, oh, by the way, we're getting rid of Zelensky, we're bringing in someone from the pro-Russian party, and he's going to... So I think Trump is in a very weak position. He's in a weak position towards Russia. He's in a weak position towards Ukraine. But then, before we leave it, I'm just going to flip it back. I'm getting the impression that you think it's unlikely that Europe and the UK are going to be able to make a massive, heroic €100 billion lift next year if the US pull out.
I think if they did that without the Americans being involved, or the Americans moving in a diametrically opposite direction, I think that's going to be very, very difficult. That's why Trump's position is so important. Let's talk about his appointments, because I think it relates to this.
I think this is a really good way in, because in the end, the reason why we care about who Trump appoints is the US president is in charge of these unbelievably consequential decisions, of which Ukraine is just one example. So you started on the subject of the Secretary of Defense nominee, Hesketh.
Do you think Hesketh is the most bizarre appointment, or do you think there are more bizarre ones?
There's a more bizarre appointment, which is Matt Gaetz, the Attorney General.
Do you think he's sitting there just carrying on the campaign strategy of owning the libs?
Trolling people.
Trolling us.
Yeah.
But he is determined to get these people. I don't buy this idea that he's basically, say, well, if I throw in 10 names and the Senate kicks out 3, I'll still get 7. I don't buy that. He's going for the lot.
Yeah. Big context for people who aren't following micro, minute by minute, his appointments. The first thing to understand is traditionally, American cabinets, unlike in a parliamentary system, often have quite a lot of heavyweights at these senior positions. And so even under Trump 1, he brought in a Secretary of State, a guy called Rex Tillerson. He brought in as his Secretary of Defense Jim Mattis, who was a 4-star Marine Corps general. And Mattis, because he'd been in the military for 40 years, brought in staff around him that he knew from years of administrations. Even Trump's first Attorney General appointments were very, very long-serving establishment members of the Republican Senate. So there was Jeff Sessions, and then Barr came in. I see a little bit of this because when I was at the Harvard Kennedy School, you would see a lot of these people rotating through. There's a sort of whole US system where often these people have been to the sort of elite, which goes all the way back to Kennedy. They often go to fancy schools. They often get Rhodes Scholarships or Marshall Scholarships. They often work in think tanks. Then they go into government, and they go into the business, and they come back into government again. So that's the norm. And Trump 2016 was still doing that. And I remember thinking then, what a contrast with Britain. Because, we've got Gavin Williamson as our defense secretary, who was like a fireplace salesman. And they've got this 4-star Marine Corps general, right? Mm-hmm. We've got Liz Truss as our foreign secretary, right? And they've got somebody who's got 40 years of serious international experience. Trump has now gone full Truss. I mean, this now feels as flimsy as a late Boris Johnson, Liz Truss cabinet. The people that are being brought in are all about loyalty over competence, atmospherics over expertise, and have nothing to do with maturity.
Or capacity, or ability. I mean, you go through some of them. And the other thing he's doing, of course, is that this thing called recess appointments, he's trying to get them appointed without having to go through all the approvals. He's also cutting out the FBI from doing the usual checks.
And recess, just to remind people, again, in the US system, to become a cabinet minister, unlike in the UK system, traditionally you have to be approved by the Senate.
Yeah, exactly. The one bit he's lost, by the way, was the Senate leader. He wanted somebody that did not get selected, and they got this guy, John Thune, who's not really a big fan. I mean, just going through some of them. So you've got Elon Musk. He's running this thing called the Department of Government Efficiency. Now, it is not a department, and only Congress can create new departments. So that may be less of a sort of crazy, it may be less effective than we think. Musk merrily talks about $2 trillion. Let's see. And also let's see whether the Trump-Musk love-in isn't already. Looking at the body language in some of these pictures that Musk keeps tweeting out, I get the feeling Trump is thinking, listen, mate, you've had your fun now. Just get back to where you've come from. So you've got Musk. You've got Robert F. Kennedy. And he's actually, on the one hand, completely crazy, anti-vaxxer. COVID was all about, killing different sorts of people and what have you. But he's also very anti-big food. And I thought one of the other pictures that came out this week, I don't know if you saw the one with some hilarious memes about it, Trump on the plane, Trump, Musk, Kennedy, Donald Trump Jr. and what's his name, the Speaker, Johnson, all with the table covered in McDonald's food, right? Which Kennedy is pretending to have to sort of to tolerate.
And I think Trump's got this very sort of strange way of kind of finding people's weaknesses, exploiting them, teasing them, mocking them, even his own intimate staff.
Yeah.
So that's his nomination for Health and Human Services. Then I think the more dramatic ones, Tulsi Gabbard, Director of National Intelligence, who very popular on Russian state media.
Exactly. That should be a sacking offence already, that she's welcomed by Russia, and she's somebody she basically bought into the line that the war in Ukraine was a result of the West NATO expansion, which is a Putin talking point. She had a meeting with Assad during the whole, and came out saying very nice things about Syria. I mean, this also poses a problem for Britain, by the way, and for the so-called Five Eyes, the whole intelligence sharing thing. You're basically talking about people here who we would identify as kind of enemies of the state, or certainly friends of our enemies. So what about the CIA guy, Ratcliffe? He's maybe less bonkers.
Yeah, I think there's two categories here. So broadly speaking, there's the slightly less eccentric appointments. So CIA, State, which is Marco Rubio, who's a relatively conventional right-wing Republican politician. In a normal Republican administration, wouldn't really raise eyebrows. Interior, Doug Berman, who's the governor of North Dakota.
He's a billionaire.
Billionaire, but not particularly controversial. Lee Zeldin at EPA, maybe. Mike Waltz, National Security Advisor, I know a bit.
Mm-hmm.
So he's somebody that I've known for a few years. He's very approachable, charming, wasn't very much part of a Trump camp, but what he has in common with Rubio and a lot of the other appointments is
China.
Very, very much a China hawk. Really Cold War with China, ran a congressional committee on China. I've been in rooms with him where he's standing up, talking about Chinese human rights abuses against the Uyghur, TikTok, Chinese infiltration, Chinese threats to Taiwan. I mean, he really sees China
which
the number
is,
one.
Fair enough. And there's an interesting sort of paradox here, though. Is it paradox or contradiction? That on the one hand, so we talk about this kind of axis that's developing between China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, the kind of autocracies. And yet, you look at this team, particularly on the foreign policy and intelligence side, and they're very anti-China, but actually quite pro-Russia.
Which I think is a Fox News staple. I think a lot of these people, and actually 3 of them are big Fox News commentators, their story is we've been distracted by Russia, Ukraine. Our real enemy is China, and we can tilt back towards China. So there's the people who are relatively conventional, and then there's the eccentric people. And the eccentric people are an energy secretary, Chris Wright, who is the CEO of
the
massive
oil and fracking company.
Oil fracking company,
yeah.
right?
And that is a major troll.
And who says there is no climate crisis, there's no energy transition.
It's all been made up.
Tulsi Gabbard, we've just talked about, Director of National Intelligence, popular Russian state media. The ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, who denies the existence of Palestinians, refuses to accept any two-state solution, says they're not settlements, they're perfectly legitimate.
There's another thing to add on him. He's a really big evangelical, and attached to that sort of wing of the evangelical church that sort of believes that the whole land that is defined by by Jews as Israel has to be taken over because that's preparation for the second coming.
Right.
Now, of course, we thought that Trump was the second coming, but in fact, it turns out it's Jesus Christ. So, and he believes in a one-state solution. And it was interesting even to see the words that he used in taking the job, like no real mention of Palestinians at all. So I think that one's pretty horrific.
Can I just sort of try to see if we can bring European or British listeners to try to understand what the analogy would be with these kinds of people? So Defence Secretary Pete Exec is like a MAGA pin-up, big, muscly, major in the military.
Good hair.
Good hair. I mean, this is very unfair to Johnny Mercer, but in some sense, he's like a good-looking guy who went to war, but was not a particularly senior officer when he left the military.
There's been some sort of pictures of him topless, and he's got a lot of tattoos, some of which are white supremacy.
Yeah, so one of them is a big thing that says Deus Vult, and Deus Vult is a Latin phrase used by the Pope to launch the First Crusade. So it's a subliminal message to Christian crusaders.
And it was a reason why he was not allowed in his former job to be part of one of in the parade for the president when Biden took over, because of his extreme tattoos. Yeah,
and then Attorney General Matt Gaetz was the most.
We've only got sex offences and drugs on him.
Yeah, so he was a really chaotic, outspoken, crazy, media-grabbing congressman who was on the verge of being expelled from Congress for allegations of drugs, sex, this, that, and the other. What would be the equivalent in the UK of a kind of a defense secretary who was a massive, popular tattoo-wearing Fox News commentator and a really outrageous right-wing member of parliament who was on the verge of being expelled? I mean, I think that's what we have to sort of bring across the sort of tone of this whole thing.
Well, I wish you'd given me advance warning of that question.
But my sense is that it is more Farageist, isn't it? I mean, it's got
Oh,
more.
it's worse than Farage.
Yeah, it is worse than Farage, and it's got a bit of the Liz Truss feel in the sense that it's sort of shock jock, provocative, not very serious, loyalty over competence, no expertise, raging against the deep state. But it's a sense of both what Liz Truss has, which is seeing the whole thing as a game, utterly superficial. I don't really care what people's competence are, presumably because Trump and Truss simply don't believe in the bureaucracy or the system of government at all. So
deep state. Well, a lot of these guys are sort of, they believe that there is a deep state that tries to sort of, take out people who don't conform to the mono view.
So, Alistair, I'm still trying to get my head around whether you can come up with a kind of analogy in British politics for these type of people. I mean, the equivalent of Matt Gaetz would be an incredibly outspoken, outrageous member of parliament who was on the verge of being expelled from parliament. The equivalent of Pete Hegseth would be some sort of amazingly outspoken right-wing commentator, shock jock, both suddenly being parachuted into the cabinet. What would be your UK equivalents?
I think it's I can't think of any off the top of my head. I guess Boris Johnson and Liz Truss becoming prime ministers, the obvious parallel in terms of, utterly unqualified. But they did at least go through the, quite a detailed, sustained process over many, many years. No, I think maybe it says that there's more madness in Trump world than there is in UK politics, however depressed we get about it. I don't think any previous president would have put forward any of the names that we've mentioned, with the possible exception of Ratcliffe, Rubio, maybe one or two others. There's another one that caught my eye, Brendan Carr, who is going to be the head of the Federal Communications Commission. And bear in mind that Donald Trump said he actually had nothing to do with the Project 2025 stuff. Brendan Carr wrote the chapter on the future of the Federal Communications Commission. Just 1 hour after he was appointed, or nominated, he did a tweet. It said, "We must dismantle the censorship cartel, restore free speech rights for everyday Americans." And who was one of the first people to give their backing to that? Mr. Elon Musk. And bear in mind, this is a guy, this is kind of not just Ofcom, this is a guy who will be in charge of decisions upon which will depend levels of subsidy to some of Elon Musk's companies.
Right.
So this is kind of, to me, this reads like potential for corruption.
And also, for those of us who feel that one of the reasons why politics has become very polarized, why populism's taken off, is because of the social media ecosystem, and have been trying to push since 2016 for more regulation, looking at these algorithms, working out what you can do to stop this fueling extremism. We've got, with the FCC appointment, somebody who's going to very much go in the other direction. If anything, social media will become more unbounded, more polarized, more extreme, less regulated under a Trump administration. Because I guess for obvious reasons. It sort of benefits him, doesn't it? I mean, in a way, he will see his victory as being.
But how does this sort of thing about free speech, and we've got the thing going on here at the moment with this sort of, I don't even fully understand this Alison Pearson thing, but it looks part of the same sort of ridiculous nonsense where the right, they love free speech, providing it's their free speech. And yet you've got Trump saying that he wants this guy to come in and sort of start shutting down TV stations. Now, we'll see how that goes. So I think the free speech argument is so kind of, they've weaponized it from a very, very particular perspective. There's one other sort of moderately, possibly quite sensible appointment, which you may not have seen. That's the White House counsel is a guy called William McGinley, who was an advisor to Trump first time round, who people said, I don't know, but people said was kind of not crazy.
Right.
So he's going to be his main legal guy in there.
So I've been reading 3 books on the Trump administration, and one of the things that's at the core of all this is, how does this all work? If you appoint these kind of people, how does the machinery of government respond? How does the civil service, the departments, respond? And there are very, very different ways of dealing. If, like Trump, you have an obsession with the deep state, you can bring in people who are real inside players. Bolton maybe was a bit of an example of this, who are trying to achieve a massive cultural shift. Or you can bring in very organized people who force through an agenda but don't try to change the system itself. Or you can have people who make a lot of noise and just preside over a system that refuses to cooperate with them. And I guess a lot of what will determine the future of America and have a lot of consequence to the world over the next 4 years is, are these people going to be able to achieve the effect? I mean, if a Liz Truss figure's put in charge of a department, how much damage can they do? How much can the department resist them? How much can they change policy? And how
I think these heads of department in the States have more power than secretaries of state, because the fact that the president appoints them, they can make considerable numbers of appointments. If you think about the fuss there is here about a cabinet minister appointing a handful of special advisors, but they will, I think, have considerable power, particularly in this first 2 years before the midterms, and where Trump has this sense of the mandate. By the way, we should point out on the mandate, he's now below 50% on the popular vote. And when you dig down to the numbers, it was way closer than even you and I felt on the night. But they forget that. They're going to operate. This is going to be like Brexit 52%. They are going to operate like they have got absolute power.
And then to finish, I guess, policy. He has signalled mass deportations, big tax cuts, drill on the environment, tariffs against the rest of the world, 10% against the rest of the world, 60% against China, and a big shift on Ukraine. And a lot of these appointments, I guess, are about reinforcing that policy agenda.
Yeah, the one thing I did see about Ratcliffe, the CIA guy, this relates to what you said earlier about China. He has likened the countering of China's rise to, it says it's on a par with the defeat of fascism and bringing down the Iron Curtain. That is his big focus. I think where he could get tricky on this, though, is with this woman Gabbard. See, I think Trump does this deliberately. He's putting people who are going to fight, because he likes the chaos and he likes being the person on top of the chaos. But Gabbard, one of her more colourful quotes about Rubio, who she said represents the neocon warmongering establishment. So there's going to be tensions in this top table policy.
So it's the Director of National Intelligence commenting on the incoming Secretary of State.
Correct.
Yeah. So a lot of these Trump books that I've been reading exactly show what you're talking about. He seems, a lot of the scenes in them describe him sitting there sort of playing his advisors off against each other, mocking them, humiliating them.
And his family.
It'd be like, I forget you, you're a globalist, you can go. And they literally have to go and sit in the corner of the room on a sofa, and then he listens to the other one, and then he brings the other one in, and then he's... And his response to tweets, how often he sees something on social media or Fox News, and he's like, that's the guy we want, I love that guy. Here's my little reading list, if people want to be honest, that I've been looking at. Okay. So Fire and Fury, Michael Wolff.
Yeah.
Bob Woodward, Fear.
Yeah. I've read the first one, not the second.
John Bolton, The Room Where It Happened.
Yeah.
And there I read first 2 chapters, and then I skipped forward to when he actually became National Security Advisor, because there was a lot about him trying to get appointed and getting frustrated.
Yeah.
But the best of them, I think, is Maggie Haberman's Confidence Man.
Okay.
Which is just an extraordinary... So she was in New York...
She doesn't like him.
No, but she'd known him forever. She covered the Trump beat for for decades before he became president.
Oh, when he was in business.
Yeah, so she really knows how his father did dodgy deals with the Democratic Party in Brooklyn in the 50s and got taken out of federal contracts for overcharging in the 60s and this kind of stuff. And then the other thing I've been reading, which I'm afraid to say is incredibly engaging, amusing, light reading, is Trump's Art of the Deal. And sort of suggests some of the charisma and appeal of him.
Yeah.
Much more to be done on this. But it's as usual with Trump. We're still on that funny oscillation between buffoonery and threat, taking seriously his appointments and his policies, and at the same time accepting that some of this is just trolling the world.
One thing we do know, Rory, is that Project 2025, which we've read, is now being rolled out. So there we are. Now, should we talk about the UK economy?
We did a thing, Alistair. Let me put you on the spot here. We were talking to a group last week, and you mentioned the missions. And I slightly cheekily said to this room of nearly 300 business people, have any of you heard of the 5 missions? And I think there was like 2 hands out of 300 went up. That's a bit problematic.
Yeah, but I think the question, a fairer question, Rory, would have been, have you heard of any of the missions?
Remind us what these missions were and when they emerged. Are they still what's guiding is the government still guided by these missions?
Yeah, they are.
And this was something they did in the election campaign?
They did it before the election campaign. So the missions...
would they have expected me to know what the 5 missions are by now?
Yes.
Okay, and what are they?
Growth.
Growth, yeah.
Not just growth, but the highest growth of any G7 country.
Got you, yep.
I'll come back to why that's a problem.
Yep.
Getting the health service back on its feet, green energy,
Yep.
safer streets, and smashing the class ceiling, which is all about aspiration, education, etc. So they're the 5 missions. I think they are still driving government agenda, but they've not been communicated as such. And I think that's because some of the work is still being done on what the policy solutions are.
And if you were in number 10 in your old job, those 5 things would be up on your wall, and you'd also presumably be communicating in cabinet and through the special advisors and to all the departments. The things that the Prime Minister really cares about are growth, health,
crime, energy,
and smashing the glass ceiling.
and education and aspiration.
Yeah.
And in fact, what Keir said recently was that his 2 big things were economy and immigration. Got to sort out immigration.
Well, that wasn't in the list of 5.
No, I know. So that's where it gets a little bit confusing.
Again, presumably, if you were a brutal business person, you'd say having a list of priorities also tells you what you're not prioritizing. I mean, otherwise it's not a priority. So what is it that they're not prioritizing that another government might prioritize implicitly in those 5? Because education's not listed?
Aspiration. That's about education.
So if aspiration just includes everything, then it's not really a list of priorities.
No, but I think the point about the missions is that they will cover different policy areas from different departments.
So it's not a priority list, really?
No, I think the mission-led government is just a different way of thinking about government. And I think one of the key people on this is Pat McFadden, who's working away putting this together now. So I don't think we've definitely not heard the last of the missions.
Okay.
The point you're making, let's just take the first one, and the other point that came from our meeting with these business guys was that they didn't love the budget.
Yeah.
It's interesting to me the way that the farmers, and we said right on the day, didn't we, that, this farmers thing could become problematical. Big campaign going on that. But actually, I think in terms of business, the national insurance changes are provoking, it seems to me, quite a lot of angst and grief. But just on the growth mission, Rory, so we had these figures last week. Basically, the economy grew by 0.1% over the first 3 months of a Labour government. Now, you can't blame Labour for that. That's taking on the economy. However, when you look at the current figures, this is about global kind of stagnation, not just the UK. US, of the 7 G7 countries, US is top, 0.7.
Yeah.
France, 0.4. Canada's in the kind of 0.25. Germany, 0.2. Japan, 0.2. UK, 0.1. Italy, 0. Okay. So that indicates the scale of the challenge.
I've always thought the big challenge is, given the last 10 years, in which basically the US has gone from being almost on par with Europe in terms of its GDP and its GDP per capita to now being certainly 25-30% larger.
Yeah.
The real challenge is, how are they really expecting, if they're going to be the fastest growing in the G7, to be growing faster than the US economy with everything we know about US natural resources, US taxes, US entrepreneurial ability, US Silicon Valley concentrations, etc.
And if you take Rachel Rees, when she did the budget, she called it a budget for growth. Okay. But actually, what did most of the people in that room understand about the budget? It was that taxes were going up to pay for the health service.
Right.
Now, the health service is one of the missions. Okay.
Right.
So I think there was an understanding the health service needs more investment alongside reform.
Yep.
So they get it. But I think that what I'm hearing more and more is actually they want to see the detailed plan for growth,
Right.
which is that about innovation? Is that about
Right.
AI?
So
Is that about planning? Is that about infrastructure?
Exactly. And this is something we've talked about a lot. And this is where, without getting too much into micro detail, I think one way of framing it is that the Tony Blair Institute and Tony Blair spent almost 3 years before this election writing their sort of Project 2025, their kind of manifesto for a new Labour government. And the way that Tony Blair would imagine growth happening, which oddly is actually not very different from the way William Hague would have seen growth happening, is huge emphasis on technology and AI. And so they celebrated Rishi Sunak's investment in supercomputers, money for batteries, etc.
Yeah.
Secondly, more globalization. They would have been much more in favour, certainly Tony Blair, of more movement of people between the EU and the UK, closer links with the European Union. And he's also very interested, Tony Blair, in the ways in which you could get the economy going by freeing up the rules around things like pension funds to provide more investment into start-up British companies and create more of a risk appetite and more energy, British investment spectrum. Now, against him is this man who has now taken over as the Chief of Staff. And the interesting thing about the new Chief of Staff that
Morgan McSweeney.
Yeah, who you
against us.
Well, I mean, interesting, you pulled me up with this. I was talking about Morgan McSweeney with this large group, and you said to the group, how many of you here have heard of Morgan McSweeney? And almost no hands went up. So we can't assume, even amongst our listeners, that everybody's got it. But just to remind people, this is the guy that pushed out Sue Gray, who was the Chief of Staff, and this is the guy who basically ran the Labour campaign. He's from a political side. He did this stuff for which I keep praising him and barking, and he's now right at the centre of it. Now, he is seen as more of a kind of centrist, old-fashioned, blue-collar Labour guy who has expressed some frustration with the more New Labour, globalisation, tech stuff, which he sees as a little bit maybe out of touch with the real concerns of Red Wall voters.
Yeah, but I'm not sure that's right. I think he understands that the reason why Peter Kyle was given this job of technology AI, and I think we'd like to hear more from Peter Kyle, we're talking to him soon, is because they do understand the importance of AI to growth. So that's where I would say an AI, by the way, is also inside the health mission.
Let me make a kind of boring policy point here, which I guess I've made before, but I just want to reinforce. The problem with relying on technology, AI, robotics, nanotechnology to transform government is that it's not just about what the technology can do. It's about the many ways in which the system will resist it. And the classic example of this is there's basically no reason why we should have any drivers on our tube trains. Go around the world. There are underground systems that don't have drivers. Why do we have drivers on tube trains? Not because the technology doesn't exist, because the unions rejected it. Another example. I remember in Cumbria trying to convince GPs to use video conferencing in order to see patients who were elderly and wouldn't move in, and GPs responding, it's just as easy for us if the patients come into the clinic. And then I said,
But COVID has changed that.
A bit, but not completely, as you will have discovered, right? I mean, when I say to doctors, they often say, well, we've embraced the telephone. Well, that's been around since the 19th century, and they've embraced it relatively recently. So the point I suppose I'm trying to make is that we underestimate the fact that often the barrier to the adoption of technology isn't what the tech can do. It's the willingness of institutions to accept it, legal barriers to taking it up, people being concerned, sometimes unnecessarily, about risk and health safety. So there the question is, do you think this is a government that is going to take risks, be radical, and force tech through when there's opposition?
Well, if they don't, then they're not going to succeed. And if they don't succeed, that is going to be a big, big, big deal. Because where does the country go if a progressive Labour government doesn't succeed? Does it go to Kemi Badenoch, or does it actually go to something even more extreme? And the one thing I think Morgan McSweeney absolutely does understand is that the policy has to meet the scale of the challenge. And if you take things like the challenges facing health and the cost and the choice that you have to make between whether everybody can have everything or whether you have to make really, blunt, difficult choices, I think he definitely gets that. And I think they do have a sense that AI, the tech stuff, I take your point about the tube trains, but I think you're looking here at some, really big changes that can be delivered across the health sector and across the education sector. So that's the kind of stuff they have to be looking at, which I don't think is yet a big enough part of the debate. Rachel Reeves I don't know if you read her Mansion House speech. Now, normally a Mansion House speech, you remember we talked a lot about her May's lecture, but the Mansion House speech kind of came and went.
Gordon Brown's Mansion House speeches were very, very famous.
Yeah.
Just remind us a little bit about how big they were, because you must have been involved in the way in which
Well,
they were publicised. And
the thing is,
George Osborne's were quite famous.
Exactly.
Too.
If you're the Chancellor, the May's lecture has become a big thing.
Yep.
The budget is obviously a huge thing. The spending review is a huge thing. But the Mansion House speech is a very, very, very big thing. Some of Gordon's biggest moments were, and it's where you set strategic course. Now, the big news in Rachel Reeves' speech, I think, was this, what she called the biggest pension reform in decades. And you were saying recently you don't have a sense of which countries this government is looking at.
Yeah, are they looking at Scandinavia? Or
whatever? She very specifically said we want to follow what has been done in Australia and Canada, where these pension schemes have been brought together and made into mega funds. So we have 86 in this country local government pension pots, which she wants to bring together in 6, which can then invest far more on a bigger scale, hopefully in our economy. But so, for example, you pointed out that some of the biggest Canadian pension fund, the Public Sector Pension Investment Board, bought for $1.5 billion the company that owns Aberdeen, Glasgow and Southampton airports. The Ontario Teachers Pension Plan owns already Bristol Airport and Birmingham Airport. So these are pension funds from Canada or Australia that are basically buying up huge chunks of British infrastructure.
It's amazing. I mean, I remember when I first met those Canadian pension funds and teachers funds in particular, how they come. I mean, it's extraordinary. You suddenly find in these financial meetings in London, you will have found this too, along with the guys from BlackRock and famous hedge funds, one of the smartest, most powerful people in the room will be the guy from the Canadian Teachers Fund.
Yeah. And again, will that be challenged? She's bringing forward a pension reform bill.
So the problem on it is this, that in effect, for understandable reasons, government made pension investments in the UK pretty risk averse. And the idea was that they would only go into instruments which were going to be pretty low risk, low return.
Well, part of her message is that we've become too risk averse.
Absolutely. So Conservative governments talked about but never achieved the idea that these pension funds can take more risk and invest more in equities in particular. More upside, more downside. And the argument is that because it's a 20, 30-year investment you're making off of the pension fund, you can afford to take more risk because the equities market will sort itself out. But they never really got it done. And they never really got it done because you can imagine the counter-argument, which is a risk-averse argument about pensions. So let's see. If she does it, that will be really interesting because it's something that the Tories talked about for 14 years and never managed to do.
Jeremy Hunt talked about it in his last Mansion House speech.
Yeah.
But I think, what does it say about our kind of culture and the media landscape? Is it because we're all talking about Trump the whole time at the moment? But I find it really interesting that the speech came. It was live on the news and all that. But I think if we were to do another business audience today and say, what was the big news out of Rachel Reeves' Mansion House speech, I think we get a pretty low turnout.
Maybe also a comms problem. Maybe, to be honest, the way in which she speaks, the way in which the speech is delivered and the way in which it's communicated may make it more difficult to land it. So remember, the point is that you would have had a comms challenge here. However important changes to the rules of how pension funds operate at the margin and whether they can put 0.5% into equities or 4% into equities sounds pretty abstruse and boring if you're running a television news item or a newspaper item. So you presumably... It's a very, very big deal, but unless you get the comms right, it could sound a bit boring.
Yeah.
So the question is the number 10 machine good enough at saying, listen, this sounds quite boring, but this could change an enormous amount. And the way you do it is you'd say, listen, if I was pitching it, I'd say, we developed amazing things in UK universities from, graphene through to AI, and they've all gone off to Silicon Valley, and all the money's being made in the West Coast because in the West Coast there are venture funds that take risk. And the problem in the UK is we're far too conservative and we're not taking risk, we're losing business. So Britain could be, the pitch would be, leading the world in tech investment if we free up these pension funds. And then I think you pitch the story around the tech, not around the rules of pension.
And then you make that part of, and this is where this is all heading in a way, and I think this will come, you make that part of your big 10-year growth plan.
Right.
And that, I think, is what business wants to hear. Because at the moment, they're a bit pissed off about national insurance. They're a bit pissed off about the workers' rights stuff, both of which can be defended. But they've got to keep making the argument as part of long-term plan for Britain.
People who are interested, the next episode of the podcast will be Question Time. And in it, we'll be able to get more into farmers and agriculture. And we'll be able to talk about Keir Starmer meeting Xi Jinping at the G20. So some really exciting issues for people who want to listen to Question Time, where we're going to focus on China, farmers, and much more.
See you tomorrow.